Transgenderism. Men identifying as women, competing in women's sports, using women's bathrooms. Trans activists influencing government, spreading violence in the streets. Controversial sex education for young kids, separating children from their parents. Offering sterilizing hormones, irreversible surgeries. Unthinkable a decade ago, now accepted, even applauded. Guest journalists Andy No, Jennifer Billick, and Tetsuhide Yamaoka join us to discuss. Welcome to International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Stephania Cox. Our conversations bring together investigative journalists from around the world. They will help to uncover hidden information and details of conflicts, alliances, and connections in a deep dive discussion. Today, we delve into transgenderism. It is highly controversial, invasive, and available to very young people. The advertising is everywhere. On the surface, it seems simple, acknowledging and accepting a marginalized identity. Where did it come from? And how prevalent was it just a few decades ago? Why is it spreading now at such a pace? As a society, we are funding sex changes for minors, stealing custody from parents, even erasing sex entirely from birth certificates. With our guests, we'll investigate the movement, how transgender ideology is being promoted nationally and internationally. Our discussion will take a deeper look at how this movement unfolded and where it's going. Time to meet our panel. Our guests today are Andy No, an independent journalist and photographer. He lives under threat for his investigations into Antifa and the militant far left. He's testified before the U.S. Congress, appeared on countless radio, TV, and podcasts around the country, and his articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Newsweek, Fox News, National Review, and more. He's the author of the international bestseller, Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, and currently is the editor-at-large at the Post-Millennial. Next, we have Jennifer Billick, an investigative journalist, activist, and artist. Her journalism has been featured in The Federalist, The Epoch Times, The Post-Millennial, Tablet Magazine, First Things, and elsewhere. Her investigative work on the power and the money behind the gender industry, now spanning a decade, can be found on her blog. You can go to the11thhourblog.com. She also appears in an Epoch TV original documentary, Gender Transformation: The Untold Realities. And Tetsuhide Yamaoka, a widely followed commentator and researcher at the Institute of Morology near Tokyo. In recent years, he's concentrated on China's global expansion, exposing the reality of a silent invasion by China into Japan. Yamaoka supervised a Japanese translation of Clive Hamilton's groundbreaking book, Silent Invasion: China's Influence in Australia, also contributing a postscript to the Japanese edition. He was a host at CPAC Japan and hosts YouTube shows on a variety of political subjects. Time to go to our panel. Welcome. Jennifer, let's start with you. If this is a movement, where did it come from? In your work, you've said it developed from transsexualism, that transgender is a useless word with no boundaries. Explain what you mean by that.
So the word transgenderism really doesn't have any borders. It's an umbrella term under which sits a lot of conflicting information and ideas. You have men with a fixation of being women and adopting their body parts through surgeries and chemicals. You have kids, young people that are adopting sex role stereotypes, the opposite sex role stereotypes, and then you have kids that are rejecting stereotypes, sex role stereotypes completely. And you have people with disorders of sexual development, and you have the appropriation of other cultures' ideas about feminine men. and how they categorize them. So you have a lot of different things under there. And when this first hit the culture running, like around 2014, we saw, this man who was the epitome of masculine virility, Bruce Jenner, on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine in a woman's corset, claiming that he was now a woman. And since that time, there's been an enormous amount of propaganda. It's been running 24/7, that people can be born in the wrong bodies. And initially, when it started, this was about body dysphoria, having an intense body dysmorphia about your sexed body. And as this has progressed across a decade, now we're looking at just people expressing themselves with sexual assaults, medical assaults on their sex.
Fascinating. Now, Andy, your expertise on Antifa has led you into the realm of what you call trans-Tifa. Who are they? Where do they come from, and what do they do?
So during 2020, when there were many months of rioting across the United States, I was in Portland, Oregon, which was the epicenter of the longest riots of anywhere else in the US. We had more than 120 nights every day of rioting. And during that time, one of my goals was to get a better understanding of who and what the profile of the riot Antifa suspect is. And one thing that emerged from that data set, because there were more than 1,000 arrestees, is a disproportionate representation of people who are so-called gender diverse, meaning they do not identify with their biological sex. And I don't think that is particularly surprising now, as we've seen more and more instances of far-left violent extremism in the US, where over and over we see the perpetrators being of some type of transgender ideology. I think in the US, we're observing this phenomenon where leftist politics, leftist radicalism is merging with trans militancy. And a lot of this language was specifically exposed by a lot of how the transgender activist groups responded to the mass shooting in Nashville, Tennessee, by a transgender shooter. In the aftermath of that, we had trans activists and groups come out and view the shooter, the murderer, as one of the victims. And a lot of the propaganda messaging at these so-called transgender rights protests feature messages such as trans rights or else, and then there's a picture of firearms, rifles and pistols, protect trans kids, and then there's an image of a knife. So the message is really clear, and I never thought that I would pivot towards reporting on transgender extremism in the U.S., although now that I've had under my belt many years of reporting on Antifa and left-wing extremism, I'm surprised that I didn't realize that this is sort of the natural and logical progression of the ideology.
And I'd like to come back to that, but first, Yamaoka-san, let's talk Japan. Why is the LGBT issue currently so big there? Does Japanese culture and tradition play a role?
Well, actually, not quite. I mean, Japanese culture tradition are quite different from those in the West. So LGBT matter has never been that big in Japan because culturally, historically, traditionally, Japan is much more tolerant on those things, right? But it became all of a sudden so big and hot because thanks to the U.S. ambassador to Japan, who's so keen, who's been vigorously trying to apply pressure on the Japanese government, the Prime Minister Kishida and other parliamentarians to pass the bill, which is the LGBT anti-discrimination bill. So because of his push, all of a sudden, the government, the prime minister, started to rush to pass the bill. He's been asking his members to work on passing the bill as quickly as possible. So that surprised the general public. And then all of a sudden, the argument became very hot here, very big here. So it's very much externally applied pressure here rather than the traditional Japanese culture here.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back with our panel discussion. Welcome back to International Reporters Roundtable. We're discussing transgenderism and the transgender movement. I'd like to ask you, Jennifer, let's talk money. Your investigations have uncovered a deep money trail behind this movement. Lay that out for us from the bottom up or the top down so that we can understand.
Okay, well, you know, most people, when they're looking at this issue, they think they're looking at a human rights movement because it's part of the LGB. But the LGB has really not been a human rights movement for a very long time. It's really become part of the, like almost a subsidiary of the medical industrial complex. And that's happened gradually since the AIDS crisis. The LGB civil rights movement was very young when the AIDS crisis happened, and it was immediately infiltrated by the techno-medical complex. And once AIDS dissipated in the United States, all these organizations, these NGOs, these big powerful NGOs, needed to repurpose this infrastructure. And so that infrastructure became gay marriage. And for many of us liberals, that was a very good thing, a positive thing. It was acceptance of same-sex attraction. But in fact, what that was a means to tie gender identity, before it actually hit the culture, to our political apparatus, so that when it was launched on the public, it would be much easier to spread around. And this is coming out of the medical industrial complex. The men behind this, and women, but mostly it's very top heavy with men in the corporate world, the banking industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industrial industry, and technology. You have the two biggest LGBT NGOs in the United States, Arcus Foundation, whose founder, John Stryker, funds the foundation through his stock in his medical corporation, Stryker Medical, which is a $17.1 billion corporation. And then you have Tim Gill of the Gill Foundation, who came out of Quark Press. Out Leadership is run by two men. The founder and the one that runs it are banking. They came out of the banking industry. So you don't have any grassroots movement coming from the bottom up. And that's how movements, because I don't really like to call this a movement, it's more of an agenda. Movements come up from the ground because of oppression, because of corporate oppression. And they seek to undermine that and to get people on their side, right? To force the hand of power. But this all is generated from the top down, very much so by many elite gay men and men with this fixation who owning womanhood for themselves.
And I know you've looked into this. I know you've looked into this quite a fair bit, and I want to hear more on that soon. But first, I'd like to turn to Andy. Could you tell us about trans activists, not just protesting in the streets and in government, been elected, and now are working inside the government to change policy?
Well, I think Ms. Bielek just kind of outlined the context for why we're seeing the militancy we're seeing now. So she has outlined the financial corporate infrastructure that is part of the support apparatus for this ideology, this movement. From there, you have a shift through the corporate infrastructure and all the millions and billions of dollars that it can provide, you have a huge change in culture rather rapidly. Ostensibly, it was mainstreamed years ago under the guise of rights for gay and lesbian people, and then just more and more identities were attached onto this movement in order to continue to justify the existence of these activist groups and nonprofits. With the culture change now, and this is very critical to the discussion, you have a mainstreaming of a tolerance for leftist radicalism. And then within that, a subset of that is then the queer and trans radicalism that we see emerge through the use of intimidation, harassment, violence, etc. And because the culture has shifted so drastically in support of that, at least in the West, that means as the so-called trans activists or trans militants, as they transgress more and more on other people's civil liberties through the use of criminal harassment or even violence or threats of sexual violence, the wider society doesn't really see that as a problem. And so we see women and those who are speaking up against the ideology being victimized over and over, and it happens quite often on camera. And there's a silence, usually from the media establishment and the Democrat political establishment. And that does a lot in actually, I would say, because there's not a lot of social consequence for the actions of these extremists, and then on top of that, often no criminal justice system consequence either, depending on the jurisdiction. You just have them pushing further and further to see how much further they can go with their so-called activism.
And now, Yamaoka-san, what's the position of the U.S. ambassador to Japan on the transgender issue? Tell us about your open letter to him.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. ambassador, Mr. Rahm Emanuel, has been making it very clear that of why he is doing this in Japan. Why is he vigorously promoting that movement to get it done in Japan, while it's never done in his own country? He said the passing that kind of bill, that having that sort of legislation to make it totally equal, fair to everyone, including those LGBTQ plus people, is the top agenda, one of the top agendas of the Biden administration. That's why he is doing that in Japan. So I decided to write a letter to him, the open letter, open question, and it was just published in one of the monthly magazines here. So now it's open, and then the actual letter will be delivered to him, and then see how it's going to respond, or if he's ever going to respond. And then so it's never been such a big matter here, and then those people do not necessarily want to come under the spotlight. And then there's no such violence or militant, those things happening in Japan either. So there's a certain cultural difference. So it's not quite right to push that sort of agenda in a different cultural context. That is Japanese culture. That's one thing we want the ambassador to understand.
Next, we'll go to a break. I'm Stephanie Cox. This is International Reporters Roundtable. See you soon. All right, continuing our discussion. This is International Reporters Roundtable. Great to have you all on. Jennifer, you've said the gender industry underlying all this action is worth $3.7 trillion, fueled by a Patients for Life model. That's a lot of money. Is there a corporate structure behind all this?
Well, absolutely. But first of all, I want to clarify that that's $3.7 trillion is a marketing constituency. That's a number for the marketing constituency of the entire LGBT globally. So that means this marketing constituency is a powerhouse now. that, you know, if you cross market to them, or if you don't cross market to them, you're going to be left out of the loop in terms of finance, because they're so big at this point. But I just wanted to clarify something else. You know, we keep talking about transgenderism and LGBT, and I think that we need to clarify what is actually going on here. This is an industry, an industrial body dissociation. This is what's being marketed to the youth. And this is what's really important here, that the youth are being targeted with massive propaganda through their schools, through their media, through our media. Everywhere they go, they're being taught that you can dissociate from your physical sexed reality, and that this is okay, and that it's progressive. And governments are getting on board with this across the world. And this is happening in the course of evolution. It's like a nanosecond. Why is this happening? It's patently absurd to think that governments are doing this for a minuscule part of the population that have dysphoria related to their sexed reality. You know, we are not changing society, the way that we're organized. Society is organized around sexual dimorphism because of these people that have body dysmorphia. This narrative is completely insane and ridiculous. So we have to look at what is happening here. Why are they promoting body dissociation as a progressive, you know, as a progressive thing? What is this narrative? And if we look at where we are in time, you know, we're coming out of the digital age and we're moving into biotechnology, you know, advancements in biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism. And so this is really, I see this as more of a grooming process for the public, because you can't just take people from, you know, from where we were as humans and sort of overtake sexual reproduction through technology, you know, without building a bridge for that. And transgenderism and gender identity is the bridge because it breaks open the market in sexual identity. Sexual orientation is just sexual orientation. You gravitate to the same sex or the opposite sex. The problem becomes when you corporatize those identities. Now, when you want to open your markets under corporatism, you have to break this apart. And there's no other way to do that, to create other sexes, than to say that sexual dimorphism is not real and put sex on a spectrum. And this is the narrative that's being driven with powerful people with lots and lots of money by funding institutions. There's different arms to deal with the different aspects of culture. Like you have GLAAD, who deals with the Hollywood and the media. So they go in there and they tell them what to say about this progressive group, right? This new addition to the LGB, right?
Yeah. Yes, it does look very broad when you take this take a step back. It's quite broad. Now, I'd like to turn to Andy. You're based in the UK. You've said the US is exporting transgender ideology there. Explain that.
Well, my hometown is Portland, Oregon, but I've recently relocated to the UK, and I've spent enough time here that I get a better understanding of the differences in how both English-speaking societies here in the US are responding to the transgender ideology. It's very clearly coming from the US in terms of the propaganda messaging and the media, because there's so much money behind it in the United States. The UK is much smaller, and on top of that, their LGBT rights organizations just don't have the same amount of financial corporate backing compared to the US. But what I see is you have activists and celebrities and all that essentially just borrowing wholesale the exact same languages from the American context on a number of left-wing ideologies, in addition to the trans stuff, things about race and BLM and anti-fascism, all that just being used in the British context, which a lot of the times doesn't even really fit. and these differences emerge a bit more on the European mainland when there are language differences and more significant cultural differences, but nonetheless still the American ideology, soft power being exported. And I mean, there's a lot of positives about American soft power, that's been able to introduce a lot of great American ideas through entertainment in music, for example, historically, and through journalism. Things like radical leftist ideologies really seems to be at the end of the spear in current American soft power. And unfortunately, I think the UK has some built-in defenses to pushing back. So, for example, there's a very strong grassroots organizing by women's rights activists in the UK against trans ideology that comes primarily from the left. And that's not really something you see in the US. I think the culture in the US has really turned the gender and trans debates into a partisan issue. It's if you're a Democrat, you're for it wholesale. If you're a Republican, you're against it. In the UK, it's different. You have a lot of traditionally socialist and left-wing and labor women activists who see very, very clearly that, hold on, this ideology eradicates the logical foundations for why there are protections for sex-based protections in the law. And so a lot of the organizing has been done by left-wing activists, and therefore it makes it much harder for the trans activists to come out and just say that this is a right-wing reactionary movement.
We'll finish our Q&A with you, Yamaoka-san. We just heard about the UK. How is Japanese society reacting to the transgender movement?
Well, I realized, having listened to Jennifer Lee, Japan is still behind. Right? The United States is far, progressive, and the UK showed some resistance, but still, ahead of us. So I talked about the cultural or traditional differences, particular to Japan. But apart from setting those cultural differences aside, the Japanese people simply don't want to import any problems, the social issues, the distractions already happening in the West, other countries, right? As simple as that. So yes, Japan is still behind, and then that's transgenderism is not that big yet, and also it's not associated. It doesn't seem to be associated with the big corporate, as Jennifer explained just yet. But again, not simply because of the Japanese traditions, cultural differences and so on. Just simply, Japan don't want to import the bad things already happening in the West.
We'll take a brief break again and return to our panel discussion on transgenderism. I'm Stephanie Cox. This is International Reporters Roundtable. Welcome back. I'm Stephanie Cox. This is International Reporters Roundtable. For our roundtable, we'll open up the discussion by asking, given the progression of this movement from its infancy till now, where are we headed? What are the stakes? And how far could this go? And how quickly? Jennifer, over to you.
Well, the whole thrust of this agenda is really to move human reproduction to the tech sector. And this is why women are being erased in language and law. And the progression of that is really, really advanced. And people need to start looking at that aspect of it instead of concentrating on identity and LGBT and, what's really happening here. Because until you really understand what's at stake here and what's going on, that they do want to collapse human reproduction and have it taken over by technology, then you can't really develop effective means of resistance to this. So we basically wind up boxing ghosts because we don't understand what we're looking at.
Andy, you're on the front lines there. What's your sense of how far this could go?
Well, I'm not really good at making guesses for the future, but what we see happening right now in real time, as Jennifer alluded to, is the erasure of language and the changing of the rules of engagement. So if we're to have a discussion, a debate, discourse about these controversial topics around healthcare, gender identity, women's rights, gay rights, etc., we have to agree on what the words we're discussing and the concepts mean. And currently, well, there was an agreement on just the basic use of, let's say, English language, but the radical left has been very, very effective at rather subtly pulling the rug out from under all of us. Now, diversity doesn't mean what we think it means. Tolerance doesn't mean what it means. Self-defense, even as how Antifa and the far left use it, and the trans activists, for example, when they are carrying out acts of preemptive violence against people, they call that self-defense, actually. And that's not what it means in the legal sense. It's not what it means in our language. But for them, they say, because you express an idea or a belief that contradicts our understanding of trans rights, we're merely defending ourselves by silencing you or punching you or maiming you in some ways. Beyond that, my biggest concern is if we're not able to have debate and discussion with one another, well, the alternative to that is violence. And we see a certain mainstreaming of acceptance of left-wing violence already, as I've mentioned. And from 2016 through 2020, a lot of the leftist political violence done in the United States was done in the name of anti-fascism because we had a President Trump, and that was very convenient for a lot of narratives. With him out of office, now we see the culture war really moved into battling anybody who dares to voice a dissenting view against the orthodoxy on so-called trans rights and transgender ideology.
And that's a very that's an experience, especially of the U.S. and other areas where U.S. culture, you mentioned, has been exported. But I want to ask Yamaoka, how do you see it in terms of Japan and where it's going?
Well, as I said, Japan is still behind quite a bit. Jennifer is saying that the movement has been pretty much driven by the business sector or financial sector as such. It's not just an ideology thing. It's coming from the top, the big corporate and so on. Somehow, we need to block that from coming into this country. So to do that, we have to understand it, the definitions well enough to protect ourselves.
To jump in on that, I think that this phenomenon that we're all talking about is uniquely, it's not really accurate to say that it's broadly a Western thing. We see it manifest primarily in the West, but it is American because of the fact of the corporate infrastructure that is behind the funding. And in the UK, I think one of the big reasons why the transgender industrial complex is less powerful is because of the fact that we, in the UK, there is the National Health Service. And so with that, medication, surgeries, and all the pricing things are negotiated by the government, and it really limits the profit-driven motives within medicine. And actually, it's been the NHS, for example, that commissioned a independent review into one of the largest clinic in the United Kingdom that did provided medical and psychological services to minors who experience gender identity issues. This is one of the clinics in Tavistock in London, which after this 2-year investigation, the findings of that is that there was a culture of medical healthcare providers being pressured to quickly recommend and support the medical transitioning of minors. And this brought into all these questions about safeguarding and also psychiatric comorbidities that were being ignored. So the NHS will be shutting down this particular clinic and opening up smaller regional clinics that will, what they say is there will have better oversight and there will be a better evaluation of psychiatric comorbidities among the young people. We're not seeing that at all in the US. In fact, you see every single, well, aside from the profit-driven corporations, all the medical associations and organizations that are seen as determining what is the standard of care, what is legitimate in medicine, what is not. All of them have been captured by the trans ideology, and a lot of them also all of them stand to benefit from making lifelong patients out of young people.
Right. Fascinating. Now, I'd like to get your take on it, Jennifer. Is it all about the money, or is culture also involved?
Well, of course. I mean, if you send something this strange into the culture, it's going to become a cultural phenomenon. But that's not where it originates. It doesn't just come out of the ether. It's sent into the institutions by philanthropy, which actually, and also the big banks, because everything that's going on here is really obscured by a human rights frame. So the power comes through the LGBT. Now, again, the LGBT is really, it's a subsidiary of Big Pharma. It's not a human rights movement any longer. But they're working through all of our human rights organizations. The WHO, the Amnesty International, the Human Rights Campaign, the UN, et cetera, right? So these, there's been principles developed, the Yogi Carta principles plus 10, which are human rights, it's a human rights legal edifice. And the 10 points have been added to bring in gender identity, right? So everybody thinks they're dealing with a human rights movement. They're not dealing with corporatism. But if you just shake that facade a little bit, it's corporatism. And these countries that have national health care are still profiting from big pharma because they have research and development, because they have pharmaceutical corporations. These gigantic corporations are international. And the law firms that are marketing this as well, developing legal structure for this ideology, which is an ideology of industrial body dissociation, are all have like the 100 most highest earning legal entities, international legal entities, have LGBT rights like a department, and they're all driving this narrative, so they're all really invested in driving this forward and creating legal structure for this. So yeah, it's alarming to say the least, because people don't know what they're looking at.
Fascinating. Next, I just want to ask you all, what path of recourse do people have, do you think, if they want to address this issue?
Well, I think a lot of people get really stuck on what they can't do. They look at this thing and when they start to see it, it just sort of grows tentacles and they go, oh my God, I can't do anything to really impact this thing in a big way. So they freeze and they do nothing. When the most important thing is to, use your skill set, whatever that is, and do something. There is always something to do. There's so many things that are needed.
Okay. And Andy?
Well, I think independent reporting on the realities of what's at risk if this transgender ideology were to really dominate even more than it is, that needs to be exposed. And there's a lot of independent journalists doing that. In bringing in the Japan angle, it's really, Japan is much further behind on this, as Mr. Yamako has said, than culturally on this particular issue compared to the US, of course, and other European countries. However, the risk is that it has such a subversive effect on society and culture, basically at every level. We've only been talking about some of the surface things about language, discourse, political violence, and women's rights, but it goes way deeper than that. It really, I think, in my personal opinion, it attacks the core of the family. And so this is why there are a lot of people who shout from the rooftops about, this is, look beyond the propaganda messaging of the narratives of it's being framed intentionally within human rights, but it's not about that. There's much more to it, and it's destructive and corrosive to basically every strata of society. And I say that as a gay man, by the way.
Sure.
What transgender movement has done to gay and lesbian people.
Absolutely. Next, and finally, Yamaoka, what's your take?
In my understanding, what's exactly behind this LGBTQ whatever movement, my understanding is a communism as opposed to human rights in general. It's coming from the Marxism, the communism, which is aiming to destroy the traditions, culture, and family, all those things traditionally carried out.
Thank you for your thoughts, Yamaoka, and that wraps up our discussion. Thank you to our guests, journalists today, Andy No, Jennifer Billick, Tetsuhide Yamaoka. Finally, to all you brave journalists out there honoring our journalists' golden rule, seek the truth and report it. Thank you. I'm Stephanie Cox, and thank you for joining us on International Reporters Roundtable. Until next time,